Hi, everybody. So welcome to our friends on the East Coast of the United States, where it's evening. Good evening to you and good morning to our friends in Korea. We're so happy to have you here. My name is Leah Bolger, and I am the president of World Beyond War. I have been with World Beyond War since it began in 2014, and I have been so excited to see how it has grown over these 7 years. Over 76,000 people and more than 600 organizations in 192 countries have signed our Declaration of Peace, pledging to use nonviolent means to end the institution of war. We now have 18 chapters in 8 countries and maintain partnerships with 89 affiliates around the world. World Beyond War is truly becoming the global movement that is required to end war forever. World Beyond War has just completed a major research project which documented almost 800 US military bases in 82 countries, including 76 in South Korea alone, one dating back as far as 1946. World Beyond War believes that the closure of these bases is a critical step towards dismantling the global security system we have today, which is based on war and the threat of war, with one based on international law and diplomacy. These bases are threatening and provocative to those countries that the United States has deemed enemies. They facilitate war, they cause irreparable environmental damage, and ironically, instead of keeping the host country safe, they make that country a target. Tonight, on the 71st anniversary of the start of the Korean War, we are so privileged to host this webinar, Ending America's Forever War in Korea, and host such prestigious guests, Bruce Cumings, Youngjae KIM, and Christine Ahn. Our first speaker, Dr. Bruce Cumings, teaches modern Korean history, international history, and East Asian political economy at the University of Chicago, where he has taught since 1987 and where he is the Swift Distinguished Service Professor and Chairman of the History Department. He is the author of many books, including The Origins of the Korean War, Korea's Place in the Sun, A Modern History, and North Korea, Another Country. He is also the co-author of Inventing the Axis of Evil, The Truth About North Korea, Iran, and Syria, and the editor of a modern volume of the Cambridge History of North Korea, which is forthcoming. He is a frequent contributor to the London Review of Books, The Nation, Current History, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and Le Monde Diplomatique. Take it away, Dr. Cumings.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I do have to apologize to you. I should have caught this myself. My colleagues would not let me be chairman of the history department for 14 years, only 7. So I no longer am chairman of the history department. Other than that, everything's perfect. I wanted to start with just 2 little items or things that I learned this week that reflect really the marginalization of the Korean War and its horrible atrocities in the American mind. I just listened to President Biden giving a short speech, and for the second or third time, he referred to 600,000 Americans or more who died from during the pandemic. And he said this is more than the total dead in World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. And each time he just elides Korea, where 35,000 Americans died. Actually, I think a much higher total than that, but that's the official Pentagon version. And it symbolizes the way in which this war is not simply forgotten, but it's also marginalized, eluded, and above all, people are given no reason to pay attention to it. unless there's some sort of crisis with North Korea, and then it's all contemporary. It doesn't go back through investigative reporting on the Korean War. The second thing that happened is that I was reading Stephen Kinzer's new book on Sidney Gottlieb, who was the CIA's chief of mind-controlled experiments in the early 50s. It really is one of the most awful records in American history, what was going on. And I know a lot about it. I've read about it. I've taught it for years, but I never realized that the US took 25 North Korean POWs, put them into some kind of camp, packed their minds with mescaline, heroin, LSD, and whatever other chemicals they could come up with to try and find a truth serum. They were doing this all over the world. But in Korea, there was an added wrinkle, and that is when they were done with these 25 North Korean POWs, they just shot them, just killed them. Now, this is a terrible war crime. And it also kind of reverses the American public opinion, particularly at the end of the Korean War in 1953, when 21 American soldiers decided to stay behind and not come home, which caused the panic and uproar in the US. And that's really one of the main reasons why there was so much hysteria about brainwashing by the Chinese and North Koreans. In fact, we were the ones doing the brainwashing, and when we were done, we just killed these 25 people. You may say 25 is not a great number, but I'm only on page 50 of the book. I don't know how many other examples there were. The Korean War was an unbelievably atrocious war. The most atrocious part being the US bombing campaigns for 3 years, long after any target could be identified that was contributing to the war effort. I'm sure you folks know about this. Most Americans know nothing about it. North Korea was turned into a moonscape with everybody living underground in one way or another. Factories were underground, schools, hospitals. People were either living in caves or they escaped to the mountains. I mean, a recent book by Soo-Kyung Hwang, who teaches at Sydney University, describes, her book is brilliant. It's 4 episodes of extreme violence during the Korean War. And of course, one of those episodes is the American bombing campaign. And she describes American pilots aimlessly, no, that's not the right word, they were aiming, but without real targets, taking out a building just because it was there and hadn't been bombed yet, and out come, dozens of little school kids because it was a school they hit, and they come back and they vomit when they get back to the base. This happened all the time. The US took the high-tech fire bombing technology that was developed in 1943 by the Americans and the British, and which was used to burn out one German or Japanese city after another in minutes. I mean, I think Würzburg took 13 minutes. And of course, Tokyo was leveled in one horrible night in March of 1945. This same apparatus was then redirected at North Korea, which was more urban than, say, North Vietnam, but not, of course, nearly as urban as Japan or Germany. And I mean, in the book that was mentioned, North Korea, another country, I have an official table from the Air Force showing 16 North Korean cities burned out to greater degree than German and Japanese cities. They expressed it in percentage terms. So Pyongyang, 80%, Wonsan, 95%, so on and so forth. And instead of some human sense of the terrible tragedy that this was causing for North Korea. You have the official Air Force history crowing about these firebombing campaigns. I once went into a part of the Columbia University Library that I'd never been in to look at technical manuals. And I found a number of, there really were magazines rather than manuals, but magazines for Air Force pilots and for ground crews and things like that. And they were talking about napalm as a wonder weapon, that it was diabolical, and the Koreans it scared the hell out of them, so on and so forth. And they also had absolutely no moral compunction about using napalm. Napalm was invented at the end of World War II. It was part of the firebombing, but it really wasn't perfected until the Korean War as a weapon for burning out cities and human beings. There was absolutely no protest about this, unlike during the Vietnam War, where Dow Chemical ended up not being able to recruit on American campuses because Dow was making the napalm that the US was splashing all over Vietnam. Excuse me. One of the ironies of this campaign, it was true of the firebombing in World War II, Korea and Vietnam, is the Air Force dropped tonnage, enormous tonnage, on the people of these countries. And it really had almost no clear effect on winning the war. Of course, we didn't win the war in Korea, and we lost the one in Vietnam. But even in World War II, the post-war bombing survey that was done very carefully showed that enemy morale, people's morale, was not deeply affected, and German industrial production actually went up when the worst bombing began in 1943. I'd like to also mention that, I'm getting ancient, and I lived through the early 50s, and I was just a little boy, but I still have powerful memories of that period. My father refused to get a TV, which irritated me no end. I had to go to a neighbor's house to watch baseball games until the Army McCarthy hearings in 1954. Then he ran out right away, had to have a TV to watch the Army McCarthy hearings. But the early 50s were the most repressive period in American history. Anyone who dissented in any way would be tarred and feathered as a communist, someone who ought to go to jail. Paul Robeson led one of the first protests against the Korean War in August of 1950 in Harlem. And the New York Times editorially denounced the very idea of holding a protest. People were fired throughout all walks of American life for their political views or their political affiliations. I think you all know this very well, but this meant that the Korean War was never seen. It's an unknown war. It never was seen. Not only was it not a television war, because that was impossible technologically at the time, but it in a sense, you couldn't see it. You weren't allowed to see it because of repression and the absence of dissent. You have I.F. Stone's book, which 31 or 2 publishers refused to put out. Finally, Monthly Review published it, The Hidden History of the Korean War, still a very interesting read. And 2 of the best books on the Korean War to come out of this period were Reginald Thompson's Cry Korea. Thompson was a war reporter going back all the way to World War I. He'd been all over the world. He had never seen the kind of random violence that characterized the Korean War. If you haven't read Cry Korea, you really should read it. It's just a great book. And the other one is Philip Knightley. It was published later. Truth is the First Casualty. Another really fine book just showing how you couldn't sort of pipe up and say anything that remotely criticized American behavior in Korea without running afoul of some authority or losing your job. So it was a completely different domestic situation from the Vietnam War. The last thing I want to say, and I don't have enough time really to give it its due, is the extraordinary violence with which the US ended the war, trying to drive North Korea and China to sign the armistice in May and June 1953. This involved breaking huge dams in North Korea with great loss of life, war crimes by any definition, nuclear threats by the Eisenhower administration, the deployment, public deployment of weapons that were tested in Nevada. I think the New York Times may have put one of them on its cover, at least that's the way I see it in my mind. Otherwise, it might have been on the inside pages, but it was the first nuclear cannon. And it looked like a cannon, only a big one. And it shot a nuclear shell that had 10 kilotons of force, a little over half of what Hiroshima was. Within a week, I think May 23rd, 1953, the US blew off such a huge bomb in Nevada that it tested that people thought a hydrogen bomb had been detonated. It was just a very, very large atomic bomb. All of this was designed to blackmail China and North Korea. It was an extraordinarily violent campaign, and Eisenhower and Dulles were really happy about it. They thought that's what led to the armistice. The fact is, the North Koreans and Chinese had decided to sign the armistice in March, in late March after Stalin died. And all of this extraordinary firepower was detonated with no real end. I mean, no achievement of the goal of presumably getting the communist side to sign the armistice. So as you can tell, I can keep on talking, but I think I had 15 minutes, and those were some of the points I wanted to make today. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Our next guest, I'm especially interested in hearing from as an activist. Now I can't remember to keep the video on. First it's the audio, then it's the video. All right, here I am again. So as an activist, I'm especially interested in hearing from our next speaker, Youngjae KIM. Youngjae is a peace activist in Seongju, South Korea. He has been organizing actions with villagers for withdrawal of the US THAAD missile system in Seongju. He has resided in So Songri, a small village in Seongju where villagers live next to the US THAAD base since 2017, when the US military deployed the THAAD system. THAAD, T-H-A-A-D, stands for Terminal High Altitude Area Defense. He served as a staff member at the Solidarity of Peace and Reunification of Korea, or SPARC, for 10 years, including working for the No THAAD Situation Office for 5 years. He joined the struggles against construction of a naval base in Hangjang, Jeju in 2012 and 2013. Please welcome Youngjae.
Hello, everyone. I am tuning in from Seongju, Korea. I am working to remove the THAAD system from South Korea. I'm so happy to meet you all. Today, I'm going to explain the background situations surrounding the deployment of the THAAD system in South Korea and the stories of a small village called Sosangri. In 2016, under the pressure from the US Obama administration, then South Korean Park Geun-hye administration ignored the strong protests of the residents and announced a unilateral decision to deploy the US THAAD missile defense system in Seongju.
그리고 2017년
In 2017,
탄핵된
the
대통령
President
취임
Park Geun-hye
상태에서
was impeached after a nationwide scandal.
반대에도 불구하고 폭력적으로
But
방행됐습니다.
the US military pushed the deployment of the system by delivering equipment into Seongju, despite strong protest of villagers.
제가 이거 사진을
I'm going
같이 공유할 수
to
있는 그런
share
자료를 준비했는데요.
some
제가 공유를
pictures.
깜빡했네요. 지금 공유해
Now
드리겠습니다.
I'm going to share my screen.
죄송합니다.
Sorry for the mistake.
네. 지금 화면이 보이시나요?
So can you see my screen now?
지금 밑에 영문으로 설명이 되어
So
있고요.
there is English transcript
이걸로
explaining the pictures. So you can see this English transcript.
많은 한국민들과 시민 사회
So
단체들은
many Koreans and civil society organizations
의 평화와 지역의 군사적
warned
균형을
that the
깨뜨릴
deployment of the
것이라고
THAAD would
사드
enhance
배치
political
과정
insecurity on the
진행
Korean Peninsula and East Asia
비판하며
region, and strongly urged the complete withdrawal of the
강력히
system
요구하였습니다.
while criticizing illegal activities in the process of the deployment.
하지만 대통령으로 당선된
However,
문재인 대통령은 국민들의 거센 요구에 반하는
President Moon Jae-in
사드 장비의 추가 배치를
ordered
지시하며
the additional deployment of the THAAD equipment after taking power despite Korean people's protest. By doing so, deployment of the full battery of THAAD was completed in South Korea.
문재인 정부는 국민들의
The Moon Jae-in
반발을
administration
현재까지
claims that
아닌
it is only a
말로
temporary
오기만 하고
deployment, not a permanent deployment, because the official deployment process is yet to be completed.
임시 배치 상태이면서도 배치가 완료된 지난
However, it is
3년간
only deceiving
지진의
people
공사는
because
물론
for the last 4
장비의
years,
교체와
internal
사드
construction
레이더의
of the
가동,
THAAD base
훈련
has been
등
in progress.
배치와
Equipment was
없는
replaced.
모습을
The radar
보여왔습니다.
system is in operation and relevant training is conducted. All these facts demonstrate that the THAAD system is officially deployed.
사드가 배치된 지역의 주민들과 전국에서 모인 연대자들은
Residents of Seongju and Kimcheon, where the system is deployed, along with all supporters coming from every corner of the country, have continued the fight to remove the THAAD and achieve peace on the Korean Peninsula for the last 5 years since 2016.
사드 한국 배치의 의미에 대해서
I'm going to further explain the meaning of the deployment of the THAAD system in South Korea.
사드 한국 배치는 미국 본토와 지역에 주둔한 미군 기지,
The United States pushed the deployment of the THAAD system in Korea to protect the continental US, its bases and assets stationed in the East Asia region from ballistic missile attack from China and North Korea, and to incapacitate the ballistic missile power of China and North Korea.
미국은 사드 한국 배치를 시작으로
By deploying the THAAD system in South Korea,
삼각 미사일 방어망을 구축하고
the United States tries to further strengthen its missile defense system connecting Korea and Japan, and therefore enhance the US-ROK Japan military alliance to ultimately maintain and enhance the US hegemony in the region.
결국 사드 한국 배치는 미국의
In a nutshell,
강화를 위한
the THAAD deployment in South Korea
미국의 국익을 위해서
is to promote the US national interest at the expense of South Korea by making it the outpost in its hegemony competition against China.
그동안 한미 당국은 거짓된 주장을 펼쳐왔습니다.
Until now, both governments in South Korea and the United States have claimed false informations about the deployment of the THAAD.
한미 당국은 한국 배치 사드가 북한의 핵과 미사일 공격으로
Both the United States and South Korean government claimed that the THAAD system is to protect South Korea from North Korea's nuclear and missile attacks.
그러나 남북 간의 거리가 짧고
However, considering that the distance between the two Koreas is short, and the majority of the Korean peninsula is composed of mountains, and there are a range of evasion methods available for North Korean ballistic missiles against the THAAD interception, such as making evasive maneuvers and simultaneous launching. The effectivity of the THAAD system in South Korea is almost none.
한미 당국은 북한의 미사일 발사를 탐지하는 목적으로
The two governments
배치 사드
have claimed that
정말 모드로만
the
사용하기
THAAD
때문에
radar is
대통령이
operated
아니라고
only in a terminal mode to detect North Korea's missile launch, and therefore it is not to deter China.
그러나 사드 레이더는 소프트웨어만 바꾸면
However, the radar of THAAD can be shifted from terminal mode to forward-based mode for surveillance by changing its software.
미국은 한국에 배치된 사드 레이더를 필요에 따라 북한은 물론
When it is necessary, the United States is capable of using the THAAD radar system deployed in South Korea to detect ballistic missiles not only from North Korea but also from China.
이미 주한미군의 긴급 작전 요구에 따른 미국의
In
사드
fact,
성능 개량 시험 과정에서
upon
레이더를
joint emergent
공격으로
operational need
사용하기도
proposed
하였습니다.
by the U.S. Forces Korea, the radar was used in a forward-based mode in its capability improvement process.
사드 철거 투쟁이 지금도 계속되고 있는데
I'm
과정에 대해서
now going to explain the continuing struggle against the THAAD system in South Korea.
반평화적이고 불법적인 초성리 사드 배치 결정 이후
When the illegal and violent THAAD deployment decision was made in 2016,
미군 관련 물품,
local residents and supporters have struggled against the deployment and blocked the U.S. military vehicles of military personnel, their materials, THAAD equipment, construction materials, and fuels on the road from passing the village to the base.
2016년부터 코로나19가 확산되기 시작하던
From
2020년
2016 to February 2020, when the COVID-19 began to spread across the world, villagers and supporters gathered at Seongju village to call for the removal of the THAAD every Wednesday and held a cultural event every Saturday. Residents in Kimcheon, a nearby city, also held a demonstration against the THAAD at the Kimcheon Railroad Station every Wednesday and Sunday.
현재 코로나19 방역 관계로
However, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, all gatherings are temporarily suspended.
하지만 매일 아침 7시 30분과 오후 4시 두 차례 사드
Still, every day, people continue to show up for an action in front of the base at 7:30 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. In addition, villagers continue to monitor the movement of vehicles and personnel in and out of the base from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. every day.
그리고 매주 2회 사드 기지 전체가
In addition,
산
the
정상에서
observation activity to monitor the base from the top of a nearby mountain where you can look down the entire base is continuing twice a week.
또한 한미 당국이 대규모의 경찰력을 동원해 폭력적인
Moreover,
물리력으로 반출입을 시도할 때마다
the US and ROK governments repeatedly mobilized massive police power to crack down on protesters to bring any materials into the base. Residents and supporters desperately struggled to stop them.
현재까지 크고 작은 충돌 상황이 50여 회를 넘고 있습니다.
Until now, there has been more than 50 crashes between the police power and the residents.
최근 미국의 사드 기지 육상 통행로 확보 요구에 한국 정부는
Recently,
기지 내부
upon the
공사를
demand of
통해서
the U.S. military to
2회
secure land
대규모
transportation
경찰력을
to the
동원하고
THAAD
있으며
base, the South Korean
격렬한
government
충돌
mobilizes a
상황을
massive police
조장하고 있습니다.
force under the excuse of remodeling the base. By doing so, severe crashes are encouraged.
이에 소성리 마을에서는 소수의
Against the
의원들이나
move,
주민과 연대자들이 강력한
local
저항을
villagers and
벌이고
supporters continue to carry out their protest in Soseongni village even under the difficult times of the COVID-19.
현재 사드 한국 배치에 대해서 주목해야 될 사안이
And
있습니다.
now I'm going to explain what we have to focus on.
첫째는 성능 개량 문제입니다.
First, capability improvement issue.
한국에 사드가 배치된 후인 2017년 12월
Since
미국은
December
사드의 레이더와
2017, when the THAAD
통신
system was
기능의
deployed in
성능을
South
또
Korea, its
개량하였습니다.
radar and communication capabilities have been significantly improved.
사드의 성능 개량은 미국 본토와 동아시아
This
지역에
is
보존하는
in line with the aim of
기지를 방어하는
defending the US
목적에
bases
부합하게
stationed in both
이루어집니다.
the continental US and East Asia.
주한미군은 사드와 패트리어트를 통합하여
The
운영할
US military
방법으로
stationed in
각
South
무기
Korea
기지의 성능을
has
개량하고
improved
합성하는
each
훈련을
weapon system's
해왔습니다.
capability and conducted training for integration of the THAAD system and the Patriot system.
다음은 기지 공사 문제입니다.
Next, I'm going to address the full construction for the base.
한국 정부는 성주 사드 기지에 미사일과 레이더가 임시
While the
배치되었다고
South Korean
하지만
government claimed
여러
that
핑계를
the missiles and
대며
radar of the THAAD are
2018년과
temporarily deployed in
2030년
Seongju,
사드 기지 공사가
construction for the base was
강행되고
conducted in 2018 and 2020 despite the strong protest of villagers.
이를 막으려는 주민들과 수십 차례 충돌이 빚어지고 있습니다.
And between the villagers to protest against the construction, the massive crash with the police force has been repeatedly conducted.
이런 공사 강행은 한국의 환경과 군사시설에 대한 법률이 요구하는 절차를 어기는 조치입니다.
Such activities are violations of South Korean laws and regulations about environmental protection and military facilities.
올해 미국 국방부의 예산 편성 내역을 보면 사드 기지를
According
완성하고
to the budget
조직 배치를
of the
공고하려는 것으로 보입니다.
U.S. Defense Ministry, it shows that the budget of THAAD this year is establishing the full scale of the THAAD base.
우리는 사드 기지를 완성하려는 한미 당국의 계획을 주목하며 강력히
We
대응할
strongly oppose and resist the plan of permanent deployment of the THAAD in South Korea.
과제에 대해서 말씀드리겠습니다.
So what are the challenges before us?
한국이 미국의 대중국 전초기지로 전락한다는 것은
If
한반도가
South Korea falls
중국권
into the
경쟁
U.S.
속에서
outpost to contain
미국에게
China,
해는 전쟁이나
it means the
전쟁의
Korean
피해와
peninsula
함께
is
희생될
increasingly
위험이
likely to be
높아진다는 것을
sacrificed in the
의미합니다.
middle of a crossfire by the hegemonic competition between the United States and China.
한국 배치 사드는 이러한 미중 패권 경쟁 속에서
The THAAD deployment in South Korea will significantly harm regional security and encourage arms race in the region under the U.S.-China competition.
따라서 비한국에 배치한 사드를 완전히 철거하고
Therefore,
대북 제재와 군비 증강,
what we have to pursue is a complete withdrawal of THAAD from South Korea and dialogue, cooperation, and coexistence, not sanctions against North Korea military buildup and enhance the military alliance. We have to build these alternative resolutions.
남북 간 종전협정, 나아가 평화협정 체결로
It is also
한반도의
critical
긴장을
time
완화해 나가는 실천이
to
반드시
practice
필요합니다.
disarmament and ease tension on the Korean Peninsula by signing an agreement to end the Korean War and ultimately an agreement for peace.
이 과정에서 남북 간 화해와 교류,
In
협력을
doing so,
강화해온 미국의
We
불안한
have an
불안한
important
개입을
challenge
막고
in front of us
이란의
to stop
중요한
the U.S.
기존의
illegitimate
통해
intervention,
강압과
hindering
협박에서 벗어난
inter-Korean
진정한
reconciliation,
가족
exchange, and
국가로 거듭나야
cooperation.
하는 과제를 안고
We have
있습니다.
to be reborn as a genuine independent country, free from coercion and threats of foreign powers by having the U.S. troops stationed in South Korea withdraw permanently.
네, 이상으로 제가 준비한 발표를
That's
마치겠습니다.
the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Youngjae. I think we're really lucky to be able to talk to an activist face to face who've been, on the ground facing the police. I have a question for you, though. Do you think the general population in South Korea are generally against the United States military presence there, or do you think it's just in pockets where there is like the THAAD base or a special base like that?
네, 주한미군에 관련된 문제는
Regarding the U.S. troops stationed in South Korea, there have been a lot of controversies and discussions about this issue. Whenever there things come out, the same issue repeatedly emerges to the hot point because the U.S. troops stationed in South Korea, they are foreign powers. And that's why we think they hinder the independent achievement of peace and reconciliation on the Korean Peninsula. So that's the common understanding of the general public, but I think we needed to put more efforts to spread the idea.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure our audience will have lots of questions for you when we get to that part. But rounding out our expert panel is now Christine Ahn. Christine is the founder and executive director of Women Cross the DMZ, a global movement of women mobilizing to end the Korean War and ensure women's leadership in peace building. In 2015, she led 30 international women peacemakers across the DMZ from North Korea to South Korea. They walked with 10,000 Korean women on both sides of the DMZ and held women's peace symposia in Pyongyang and Seoul. Christine is the international coordinator of the Korea Peace Now transnational campaign, which Women Cross the DMZ launched in 2019 with 3 other feminist peace organizations. Christine helped create the Feminist Peace Initiative, which Women Cross DMZ built with Madre and Grassroots Global Justice Alliance to reimagine a feminist movement-driven U.S. foreign policy. She has addressed the United Nations, the U.S. Congress, Canadian Parliament, and the ROK National Human Rights Commission. Her op-eds have appeared in the New York Times and the Washington Post, and she is a regular contributor on MSNBC, Democracy Now!, and CNN. Christine?
Thank you so much, Leah and World Beyond War and Bruce and Youngjae. It's such an honor to be on this panel with you. And we have a lot of work to do. Before I start my brief presentation, I thought it would be useful to show a little documentary, a trailer of a documentary that is almost near completion. It's by Deanne Bourchier-Lim, who is an Emmy Award-winning documentary filmmaker who has done many films about Korean adoption, but also one called Memory of Forgotten War. And it would be great when the film is out for those on the webinar to reach out to Women Cross DMZ and to Deanne to try to screen it in your community. So without further ado, let me just share this trailer.
As a daughter of South Korean immigrants, I grew up being told stories about our homeland.
This is Korea, a nation divided at the end of World War II at the 38th parallel.
These stories made us fear North Korea, and it was something that I never questioned until much later.
More than 60 years after the ceasefire, North and South Korea and the U.S. are still technically at war.
I decided I needed to meet the people that were supposed to be my enemy. And that's when I started to understand the legacy of a war that never ended.
Breaking now in North Korea, women from around the world are preparing to make a demonstration for peace.
A prominent women's activist group is planning a symbolic and controversial walk across the demilitarized zone.
Women are disproportionately impacted by war and violence, and it's time to have a seat at the table.
A lot of people say it was naive, and you cannot do this. Several hundred people are here to counter-protest against us. Anyone who calls on engagement with North Korea, they've been maligned.
If there's not agreement between the two militaries, the government does not feel that our safety would be assured. What are we doing that is so threatening? People think that the only way North Korea can be dealt with is to eliminate it. There is an image that there aren't real people and that they must be destroyed.
시민들 같은 경우는 마음의 분단심이라고 하나요? 마음의 삼팔선들이 있어요, 사실은.
This artificial boundary has kept Korean people separated.
Okay, so thank you for allowing me to share that. So my talk follows Bruce's important historical perspective. I think it's so profound what he said about during the Korean War was one of the most repressive in the United States. And then Youngjae's presentation about how the current unresolved conflict is justifying massive militarization on the Korean Peninsula. So what I would like to share is how the Korean War has impacted me and so many Koreans, and how a transnational peace movement, which all of you are a part of, is helping to finally bring closure to this war. Many people ask me how I got involved in this work. I'm the youngest of 10 children. I was born in Seoul. I immigrated with my family to the US when I was 3. My upbringing, like many immigrants, was marked by a lot of instability. And to heal the trauma I endured growing up, I sought to understand the world and the root cause of my family's suffering. And naturally, this process led me to the Korean War and its profound impact on my life and that of Korean people. As has been the case for many Koreans who have worked for peace and the reunification of Korea, my journey has not been easy. Countless activists before me have been killed, tortured, imprisoned, accused of being spies and traitors. Well, I too have been red-baited, surveilled, denied entry to my homeland, and hardest of all, alienated within my own family because of my work for peace and demilitarization. A decade ago, I traveled to Seongju village on the southern tip of Jeju Island to join a protest against the construction of a naval base, docking US Aegis destroyers. These are part of the US missile defense system produced by Lockheed Martin. The villagers, made up of farmers, fishermen, henyos, the women sea divers, they used nonviolent tactics to try and block the naval base from being built on their village. Despite being home to endangered species, several UNESCO biosphere reserves and World Heritage sites, and the source of fresh spring water to almost half the island, the lava rock was blasted, it's covered with concrete, and it became home to a sprawling naval base. As for the Seongju villagers, they were assaulted, they were fined, they were imprisoned for trying to protect their home. 3 years ago, actually, to this day, I visited Seongju, and it just broke my heart to see what was once a beautiful place destroyed forever. This militarization is happening in South Korea, the United States, North Korea, China, Japan, and throughout the entire Asia Pacific region. And it is a consequence of the unresolved Korean War and increasingly the mounting rivalry between the US and China. So the unresolved war is being used by governments to justify the insane regional arms race. And it also impacts the day-to-day life of millions of North Korean people. In 2013, as I had just began turning my dream of a women's peace march across the DMZ into reality, I was given the green light to travel to Pyongyang to negotiate the crossing. My daughter Jeju, who I named after the beautiful island of peace and women, she was just 22 months old and she was still breastfeeding. I realized that I couldn't leave her for the length of time it would take to travel all the way to North Korea and back, which requires flying to Beijing, catching one of a handful of flights to Pyongyang. You have to get your visa. So I decided to ask the counselor at the DPRK mission to the UN if I could bring her. He quickly wrote back. He said, yes, we will give her a visa, and they would even provide childcare on the day of the meeting. So in February of 2014, in the dead of winter, Jeju and I boarded a flight to Beijing. When we landed, the smog was so thick we could barely see the ground. It happened to be on a day when the Chinese government cautioned against going outside. Unfortunately, Jeju developed a cough. And as we waited to board our plane to Pyongyang in Beijing, her cough got progressively worse. My colleague, Hejung Park, and I, we weighed whether to go or not. And I decided it was better to go rather than wait more days in Beijing. So we flew to Pyongyang. We stayed at a guest house where the host provided a generous meal, but poor Jeju, coughing incessantly, couldn't keep the food down. That night, I lay close to her chest, listening to her labored breathing. I decided to turn on the hot water in the bathroom to generate steam to help her breathe. Finally, after some time, someone knocked on the door to see if everything was okay. I opened it and I said, I think we need to go to the emergency room. My daughter is really struggling to breathe. So in a flash, he said, absolutely. So we all jumped into the minivan, which sped through the streets of Pyongyang. And you can imagine those headlights were among the only lights in that city. We pulled up in front of the hospital where foreigners go, and a doctor and nurse came out quickly, greeted us, and rushed us down the freezing corridor because there's no heat in this hospital, right, in the dead of winter. So he took us to the only room that was heated. He started to ask me questions, and he took his stethoscope and he put it on her back. And what happened at that very moment? The electricity went out, the lights went out, as it regularly does in North Korea. And I just, at that moment in the darkness, I just sobbed. I sobbed because I was crying for my daughter, who I had placed in extreme danger for peace, but also for the North Korean people who have to live in such difficult conditions. Well, yes, thankfully, Jeju recovered, and the North Korean officials, because they saw how difficult it was. And I think, you know, here is a mom with her daughter coming to request a peace walk to end the Korean War. I'm sure it helped. So I left with an MOU committing to allow us to cross the DMZ. But that moment seared into my mind just why exactly I do this work. While Jeju and I were able to return safely to Hawaii, the North Korean people must continue to live with scant resources as a result of this brutal sanctions regime. North Koreans are the most sanctioned people in the world. To understand just how sanctions impact the North Korean people, especially women, in 2019, the Korea Peace Now campaign, we commissioned this international multidisciplinary panel of experts report called The Human Costs and Gendered Impact of Sanctions on North Korea. It's all on the Korea Peace Now website. It found that while state sanctions state that they are not intended to have negative consequences or impact the work of humanitarian agencies, evidence shows that in practice they do. The authors estimated that sanctions-related delays and funding shortfalls may have resulted in the deaths of thousands of people in 2018 alone. Today, the situation is exacerbated by COVID-19 because It is a pandemic of global inequality that intersects with other existing problems. We can't blame North Korea for deciding to close their borders, given that their healthcare system has been decimated by sanctions. Sanctions totally failed to accomplish their intended goal, which is pressuring North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons. In fact, pressure in the form of sanctions, isolation, military threats has only exacerbated the problem. The US routinely holds joint military exercises with South Korea, but a recent study found that these war drills don't deter North Korea, but instead, quote, incites provocative rhetoric and actions, end quote. Thus, despite being one of the most sanctioned countries in the world, North Korea has up to 60 nuclear weapons. So the risk of another war is real. Since the Korean War ended with a ceasefire and not a peace agreement, the US and South Korea have come dangerously close to renewed military conflict. Both sides have weapons pointed at each other, ready to pull the trigger. We believe that to convince somebody to put down a gun, you first have to convince them that they will not be harmed. We need to address the root cause of the conflict, which is the unresolved status of the Korean War, to build trust, create the necessary conditions for denuclearization. That's why a security guarantee in the form of a peace agreement must come at the beginning, not at the end of the process. So the Korea Peace Now campaign recently produced the Path to Peace report based on this basic principle. This is a beautiful report. It's available online. And if you email us, we'd be happy to mail you a hard copy. The principles: peace now, peace first, without preconditions or sweeping demands. Our report explains how a peace agreement can advance issues such as denuclearization and improved human rights. The report also calls for the inclusion of women's groups in civil society, because when women's groups are involved in peace processes, an agreement is more likely to be reached and to endure. Studies also show that when women participate to help legitimize the formal peace process among the public, it actually leads to peace. And so that's what we're doing at Women Cross Team Z and with the Korea Peace Now campaign. So for example, we're building support for a peace agreement in the US Congress, which will ultimately have to ratify a peace agreement. In the last Congress, we helped mobilize 52 co-sponsors of House Resolution 152, which calls for ending the Korean War and a peace agreement. In the new Congress, Representative Brad Sherman from California, he's a national security Democrat who serves on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He recently introduced House Resolution 3446, the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act, which calls for, quote, serious, urgent diplomatic engagement in pursuit of a binding peace agreement constituting a formal end to the Korean War. Sherman, who once called on North Korea to first disclose its entire nuclear arsenal at the beginning of any dialogue, and for more sanctions. This was in 2018 at the Singapore summit. He is now calling for lifting the ban on Americans traveling to North Korea and for establishing liaison offices. That is change. And that is the result of incredible grassroots pressure. And it shows that when we organize, we build power, we can change the conversation. So in 2 years, the Korea Peace Now campaign, we've organized grassroots chapters in 12 regions across the US, where multi-generational Korean Americans, peace activists, veterans, students, small business owners, academics, we collectively press for an end to the Korean War. We collect signatures on postcards. We organize house meetings. We write letters to the editors. And so from July 11th through the 16th, we will all gather with other grassroots networks to urge members of Congress to sponsor this new resolution, 3446. So we have over 250 people signed up. We would love to reach 300. Well, those of you that are in the US, join us. 3 hours to collectively raise our voices together to call for an end to the Korean War. This is truly a people-powered movement to move US foreign policy away from militarism and endless wars, because the consequences impacts us all, from the Okinawan people fighting the occupation of US military bases, to the Chamorro indigenous people of Guam, who would be targets of North Korea as retaliation against a US first strike, to those of us here in Hawaii, where 20,000 US Marines will be moved to Oahu as part of the US pivot to Asia, So on this anniversary of the Korean War, we must ask the question, what kind of future do we want for ourselves and our children? The pandemic has laid bare that all the investments in weapons and preparation for war won't protect us, and that what we need is a fundamental reorientation of what makes us secure. Food, homes, healthcare, a clean environment. We must end the Korean War because the status quo means more violence. Violence against innocent North Korean civilians living under sanctions, separation of families who remain divided, fear of war and each other, and repression in the form of national security laws in both Koreas. As Bruce has written, the Korean War inaugurated the US military-industrial complex. It quadrupled US defense spending, and it set forth the US as the world's military police. Ending this longest US war won't just help reverse America's long march of militarization and remove the risk of a catastrophic nuclear war. It will have tangible effects on people's lives throughout the Asia-Pacific region and neutralize the great power competition between the US and China. Peace is the only way forward. And with women leading the way, I believe we can and we will end this war. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine. And thank you so much for all the work you're doing and for sharing your very personal stories. I think what you said reminds us that the people want peace, and it's the people who suffer, and the people who decide that we're going to war, they're not the ones who suffer. So the people, our stories, that's how we make change. So we'd like to open it up now to questions from the audience. If you'd like to ask a question, you can put it in the chat, and I see some people have done that. Or you can click on the question button on the bottom of your screen. It is in the reactions. Yes, in the reactions button. You can click to raise your hand, and then I will call on people. I will call on the people who raise their hands, and then Greta or Rachel will call on people in the chat. So the first question, I think I'll ask Michael Hoy to unmute yourself and ask your question, Michael.
Okay, did I get unmuted?
Yes.
My question deals with the role, sort of what Bruce was talking about in the beginning with what Sidney Gottlieb was doing in Germany and in Asia and other parts of the world. And that's the idea that we have men that do the secret things, the special operations or CIA or one of the other alphabet agencies. And we don't even consider that war sometimes. I mean, we can have men doing terrible things, or women, men and women all around the world, and goading these different nations into some kind of response. And then when they, when we get that knee-jerk reaction, we say, well, my God, look at what they're doing. We have to go beat them up because they just kicked at us. And that is my question. I mean, sure, we can stop official wars, but can we stop special operations? Can we stop the secret services, the intelligence services from continuing to fight anyone who's anti-colonial? Because it seems to me, based on my reading of history, that after World War II, even though we taught everyone that we were anti-colonial, everything we did around the world would scream at everybody, hey, if you fight our new colonial mindset, our debt peonage, or whatever one wants to call it, we will beat you up, like we did in Indonesia in the 50s, or help.
Michael, can I ask you to form your question, please?
I'm sorry, Leah, I thought I kind of formed the question. So what I'm asking is, since there are all these men that do these things that most Americans are not aware of, how can we effectively have peace anywhere?
Well, I think the answer is that we can't. I'm sure there are covert actions going on now that we know nothing about that affect relations between North Korea and the US or China and the US. But in the early 50s, the CIA was a loose cannon. It had a, excuse me, it had a huge budget. Didn't really know what to do with it. And Allen Dulles, who headed the CIA, was the brother of the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. And they, I mean, the Gottlieb business is just one aspect of dirty tricks and spying and trying to overthrow governments, above all in Iran in 1953 and Guatemala in 1954, that were considered to be just wonderful by the CIA and people who knew, who were witting about these kinds of things. What can ordinary people do about it? One person who's not really quite ordinary, but Nicholson Baker is a great American, both a writer of novels and of nonfiction. He recently published a book called Baseless, and it has two themes. One, he comes as close as anybody to proving that the US used germ warfare during the Korean War. I can't get into it, I don't have time to get into it, but if you read the book, you see that it probably was a black operation, not to kill people with germs, but to sow panic behind the lines, which worked. North Korea had, inoculation campaigns going on all over the country. The second part of Baker's book is how he's been trying for decades to use the Freedom of Information Act to get documents and is constantly frustrated. I mean, he's indefatigable in trying to get certain documents, but they won't let him have those documents. And it's just a book that shows how hard it is for Americans in a democracy to have any democratic control whatsoever over our 17 intelligence agencies. I thought there were only 15. Now we got 17. Who knows what number 16 and 17 are. Thank you for that question.
Great. We have a question from the chat for Christine. Christine, are there nonviolent ways to address human rights concerns in North Korea that don't harm everyday North Koreans?
I think that's such an interesting framed question. I mean, behind the question is that human rights has been weaponized, and that there is a way in which human rights abuses are used to justify military intervention, or regime change. So I think, back to my point, I think we need a peace first approach. We need it whether we want denuclearization, we need it when we want to improve human rights. We need it when, even the most basic thing. I was on a conference yesterday with a group called the Korean Sharing Movement. It's the largest South Korean civil society movement. They've provided humanitarian aid during the arduous March years in the 1990s when North Korea was under famine. They've then, during the sunshine years between North and South Korea in the 2000s, set so many people, resources for development. And all of that has basically come to a screeching halt because of the situation between North Korea and South Korea and the US and North Korea. So, that's where I tend to just follow. I know it's going to be tiring to hear it, but we need to get to peace. And I think that will be an incredibly important step towards normalization of relations. You look at something like the UN Security Council resolutions 1718 that were passed in 2017 during the whole Fire and Fury era. What happened? What was banned? One concrete thing that was banned were textiles. North Koreans could not export textiles. And there were instantly 200,000 jobs that were eliminated. Who do you think works at those textile factories? Women. Women work at those textile factories. And when women have access to resources, who benefits? The children. They get to eat, they get to go to school. So I think we have to look at it from a very holistic point of view. And frankly, ending the war is going to be the best thing that will bring North Koreans into the global community. They want to be a part of it. A lot of Kim Jong-un's policies have been in preparation, right? Opening up, greater liberalizing the country. And we and the United States are the big obstacle. I mean, North and South Korea in 2018, when they signed the two declarations, Kim and Moon, Panmunjom and the Pyongyang declarations, they wanted to end the Korean War. They want to transform Korea into a land of peace. They want to see development in North Korea, which will improve the day-to-day life of North Koreans. We have to see that link between peace and human rights.
Thank you, Christine. Our next question will be asked by Ben. If you can unmute yourself, Ben, and ask your question.
Hi, my question is for Youngjae. 힘들어도 한번 한국어로 질문 드릴게요.
Try to ask in Korean. I was born in the United States, but I'm a young generation of Korean Americans. I was born in the United States and raised here. I was so inspired by the story Kim Youngjae delivered. And I was so moved by the pictures of old grandmas fighting against the third system in South Korea. Like these pictures made me tear. And as a Korean American, young Korean American living in the United States, I want to know what we can do to support the fight against the third system in Seongju. So in fact, it doesn't require any physical power because it is limited to those people who are actually fighting against the police power at the site. But what we can ask from the people living in the United States is that you have to remember that all the plan, all the order is made in the United States. The budget is allocated in the United States to deploy the third system in South Korea, and it is not for the national interest of South Korea, but the national interest of the United States. So the deployment of the third system in South Korea is only sacrificing South Korea for the interest of the United States. So it is possible that additional deployment of the third system or the capability improvement of the radar and communication system. We may expect additional actions or improvement plans to be implemented by the United States. So if you have any information about what's going on in the United States regarding the third system deployed in South Korea, then it will be very helpful for the people fighting at the site.
그래서 굳이 이제 그래서 굳이 사드 철거 투쟁을 위해서
So in order to join the struggle against the third system, you don't have to come to South Korea and to be at the site.
미국 현장에서 미국
Rather, you can do more where you are now by raising your voice against the third system in the United States and delivering the message to the general public in the United States about the issue. and that will be more helpful to resolve the issue.
그렇다고 뭐 한국에 오시면 당연히.
But I'm not saying that like, we are not going to welcome you if you make a visit to South Korea.
Great, thank you so much. Let's take another question from the chat. There's a question that says, the current South Korean president campaigned in part on improving relations with North Korea. Is he handcuffed or blocked by the US? Any speaker can address this.
Well, I think President Moon Jae-in has his heart in the right place, but I think he hasn't campaigned against the U.S. nearly as hard as he should have to normalize relations with North Korea or simply to pursue reconciliation projects between North and South. He's a good man, but compared to Kim Dae-jung or even Roh Moo-hyun, in his entire term so far, and he's only got nine or 10 months left, he just hasn't been strong in standing up to the United States. That's my view anyway.
Thank you, Bruce. Our next question will come from Kil-sang Yoon. If you will unmute your microphone, you may ask your question now.
Kim Sen-seng?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, I think I'd better just speak in English. I really appreciate for your hard work and your, such a long time to resist this, third deployment in our land. Okay. I really appreciate for this. However, is there any movement in Korea to tackle the root cause of this? Yeah. According to the armistice agreement, within 3 months, the related countries should have peace of, talk. But U.S. just, didn't follow that, and even foreign troops was supposed to withdraw from Korea. However, U.S. made mutual defense agreement with South Korea on October 1, 1953, in my knowledge. According to that mutual defense agreement, U.S. can use any land, any spot in Korea, southern part of Korea, for their military installment. Isn't that the kind of, South Korea is tied down with that treaty with the USA. So you of course mentioned that at the last part of your share, that South Korea should really restore its sovereignty as an independent country. But for the time being, lasted 70 years, South Korea has been handpicked by the US. It's controlled by US Northeast Asia policy. Yeah. And is there any movement to talk about this now, to revise this kind of things? And even so far, the status of foreign arms. Yes, it is very unequal treaty. Okay, so, you people spending time, that energy on the streets, in cold weather, in heat, under the heat wave, but somehow, maybe in US, how can we really work together?
Okay, I think we're going to have to leave it there and let I think Christine could answer that best. Thank you. Thank you for your question.
Oh, I thought it was to Youngjae.
Oh, I'm sorry. I misunderstood.
Yeah.
네네. 물론 한미
Yes.
상호방위 조약
Mutual defense treaty between the United States and South Korea But I think the treaty itself is problematic. But at the same time, by using the mutual defense treaty, the United States has actual control of the South Korean military during the wartime, the operational control. And by taking excuse of this mutual military defense treaty, yes, actually the United States is trying to control everything in South Korea. And so like, for example, if a South Korean general, like a high officer, wants to visit the DMZ, then he needs to get the permission from the commander of the United States force stationed in South Korea. So because it has the equal power authority as the UN commander. And so that makes South Korea difficult to act independently in building peace and working for reunification. In the near future, maybe Koreans will demand for the withdrawal of the US troops in South Korea, but it is not natural for foreign armies to be stationed permanently in a foreign country. That is a kind of colonialism. So in order to have peace on the Korean Peninsula and reunite the two Koreas, yes, we have to build our sovereignty to be an independent country. I don't think it can be achieved in a day, but we have to continue to build our capability and capacity to achieve this goal.
Great, thank you. Let's take another question from the chat. Could the speakers speak a little bit more about the nuclear arms race? And in particular, do you think that North Korea has the right to nuclear weapons to protect itself from never-ending US imperial aggression?
Bruce, do you want to answer that one?
I couldn't figure out who was providing the question, but I've been happy to answer it. One of the really absurd things about American discussion of North Korea is it is never brought up. You know, if you're talking about CNN or the New York Times or centrist media outlets, it is never mentioned that the US is the one who first introduced nuclear weapons to Korea in 1958, breaking the armistice and self-consciously doing so. I mean, the documents show that Secretary of State Dulles was very aware that the US was violating the armistice. So they put in Honest John rockets, Matador cruise missiles, both nuclear tipped. Pretty soon they had nuclear mines, which a soldier could put on his back. They weigh 60 pounds and run around in a Jeep to place them. We had hundreds of nuclear weapons. Now, nuclear science 101 or political science 101 will tell you the only real remedy when you're threatened by a nuclear weapon and you don't have one is to get one. And it actually took North Korea quite a long time to do that. But by 2006, they had blown off a nuclear weapon. And the US wants and never stops talking about how the North Koreans have to give up those weapons. But anybody with half a brain sitting in Pyongyang, whether he's a communist or a capitalist or believes in the Virgin Mary, is going to have, I'm sorry if I offended anybody about that, but it is it's another fantastic story that all too many Americans believe. But anyway, it's just not going to be the case that when the US threatens North Korea with nuclear weapons, North Korea will ever give them up. And the threats are not now Matador missiles and nuclear mines. They are heavy bombers that can actually leave the American Midwest on one mission, 24 hours, drop their bombs over Korea, and get back without ever having to ground the plane, land the plane. And President Obama, in addition to his disgusting and stupid decision about THAAD, he also was probably more involved than any other president in sending nuclear bombers to intimidate North Korea. I mean, it's just absurd on its face. I don't know what other analogy I can use for who might be in power in Pyongyang, but anybody in power would want nuclear weapons because of the deterrent effect. But of course, most Americans think North Korea is crazy and shouldn't even have a bomb, let alone a nuclear bomb. But it's just nuclear weapons 101 that they sooner or later we're going to be dying to get a nuclear weapon. I actually,
Thank you. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't go on, but I don't understand the mentality where the American people are never told about the American nuclear background of hundreds of nuclear weapons in Korea. It's an absolutely crucial fact for understanding US-North Korean relations. And I don't know how many times I've given a lecture where I say, about we had hundreds of nuclear weapons. And someone will come up afterwards or raise their hand and say, are you sure your information is correct about those nuclear weapons? And it's just very, very frustrating. You can't have a debate because essential facts are not on the table.
Thank you for that. Our next question will come from Dongwon Oh. If you can unmute yourself, and I would like to remind all the questioners to keep your question brief so we can ask as many as possible. Thank you. You can unmute yourself now. There you go. There you go.
Thank you so much for today. It's been very enlightening. I guess it's a two-parter. I'll keep it brief. What do you think first of the current military conscription service in South Korea? I know that it's less than perfect, and I've been through it myself, and the abuse has gotten better, but not the redundancy part of it, I believe. I discharged in March 18 from the artillery brigade. And besides the geopolitical security related interests, what do you think some reasons are for the US keeping its presence in the Korean Peninsula? Yeah, those two questions.
Are those questions, maybe Youngjae can answer the first one about the military conscription? And I'm happy to respond to the second question. Yeah.
징병제 관련해서
Regarding the military conscription, I was actually writing down my answers on the chatting box. I'm going to explain. As of today, there has been increasing debates about the military conscription service in South Korea. The system should be changed. I think compared to the military capability in terms of the number of weapons and the advanced system level, I think we have like too many soldiers actually. And we are also enhancing the military power compared to those neighboring countries. So I think the system, like military conscription system, should be eliminated. It is a violation of human rights because you are forcing people to join the military despite their different thoughts and political beliefs. So the system should be eliminated in a near future.
Christine, were you going to answer the second question?
I mean, it's very simple, but I mean, I think the US wants to maintain its military footprint on the Korean Peninsula because for the same reason that it has done so for the last 100+ years, right? Throughout the entire Asia Pacific is, Thomas Friedman once famously said that the invisible hand of the free market needs the invisible fist of McDonnell Douglas, right? And so it's to maintain dominance, hegemonic control over the entire region. The US bases are part of the 300 US bases throughout the Asia Pacific encircling China. So that's why we have to close those bases. And I think that, in this moment where the United States, where we're facing massive problems in terms of healthcare, getting our economy back on track, the pandemic, this is something very tangible that could actually save money for this country and actually reinvest it in things that will truly give us security. So we only have like 1 more minute though, right, Leah? So
yes, we're really winding down. And I know, did you want to remind everybody that today is the deadline to register for?
Yes. Yeah. And Kathleen, I think she posted it, but maybe Kathleen can do it again really quickly. So we are doing these advocacy days. We have 250 people signed up. It would be awesome if many of you joined us. It's just like basically an hour or two to commit to meeting virtually with your member of Congress and urging them to support a peace agreement with North Korea. And there's also a link, an Action Network appeal that can be directly emailed to your member of Congress. So we'll post that in the chat one more time.
I will just tell everyone that all of the links and references that have been in the chat, Greta will be sending those out to everybody who registered for the webinar today. So you'll get all that information. And I'm so sorry we don't have time for questions. I know some of you have had your hand up for a while now, but we want to be respectful of our guests' time, and we have no more time for questions today. So I'm going to thank everyone on behalf of World Beyond War. I want to send a big thank you to all 3 of our wonderful guests, Bruce Cumings, Youngjae KIM, Christine Ahn, and a special thanks to our interpreter, Youngjae Kang, as well as Yukyoung Ko, who was the person who helped connect us with Youngjae. So thank you so much to making that part happen. And lastly, as always, I want to thank the World Beyond War staff members, Greta Zaro, Rachel Small, and Mark Elliott Stein, who do such a great job handling the tech part of our World Beyond War webinars. And one last pitch, if you haven't already signed our Declaration of Peace, I urge you to do so. You will be joining our ever-growing network of global contacts, and that will help you keep in touch with us about what we're doing, other webinars that will be coming up, and the work that we're doing. So WorldBeyondWar.org, you can do that. And thank you so much again for your participation and your sharing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye, Youngjae. Bye, Bruce.
Bye-bye, Christine.
Bye.